Welcome. Once again, it's great to see all of you folks coming to what is the second presentation in this year's Psychology Department Speaker Series. I'm Dr. Frank Connor, and I am the head of the Psychology Department. It is my honor to introduce to you Professor Lois Owens. Professor Owens is the director of the Graduate Admission Program at Grand Valley. She is also a graduate professor in the social work program at Grand Valley. Professor Owens received her graduate degrees, one in social work and one in communications from the University of Michigan. So please welcome Professor Owens.
Thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here, and it's also very scary to be here. It's scary because I'm never sure when I'm speaking that I'm the person that's supposed to be speaking. But people keep asking me, so I say to myself, well, yeah, I can do that. I know a little bit about that, I think. And it reminds me of the first time that I was ever asked to adjunct at a university, and I didn't have a degree. So I said to them, I don't have a degree. And someone said, well, the gentleman who was talking to me said, well, they said that you know a lot about this, so we thought we'd ask you anyhow. So I figured, well, the one way to do it was to stay at least 2 weeks ahead of the students. And I went to the library, I got 13, 14 books and started reading, did an outline, and then I went and taught the class. And I stayed 2 weeks ahead of the students the entire time. And the only way I could do that, of course, was to ignore my children at the time, who were very kind of resentful about it because I was living in Ann Arbor and teaching in Detroit. So my way of dealing with that is I said to the one that was 16, if you allow me to get through this, just this first time, because I'd like to be able to do this again in life, then when you are, when your birthday comes up in August, you'll be 16, you can have a driver's license and you can date girls because I won't have to drive you. And that was how I actually began teaching as an adjunct without a degree, which then said to me somewhere along the way, maybe you need to get a degree. But this was in the 60s, before most of you were born. And I was already a mother of teenage children, so obviously I'm nearing an older part of my life. The halcyon days of floating along, enjoying everything, and also experiencing what it means to go through ageism with coworkers and sometimes friends and former high school classmates who want to say, why aren't you retired yet? Why are you still working? Well, can you still see? Or when I was down at emergency a couple of nights ago, because you're 73, we think we ought to do so and so and so and so, right? And I kept thinking, there's something wrong with this. These sound like microaggressions to me. And I've actually been studying and working in the area of microaggressions now for the last couple of years. I teach cultural competency courses as my primary course at Grand Valley in the School of Social Work at the graduate level. And cultural competency, of course, is a spin-off from our former diversity, then multiculturalism, or was it the other way around, and we included tolerance, and now we're at cultural competency, and who knows what it'll be as we move down the road. But being culturally competent, of course, means looking at all the diversity that's in this room and then becoming aware about that diversity so that you can become competent in working with, handling, talking with, and socializing with everyone. So culturally competent is an ongoing lifetime piece. You will never, ever be totally culturally competent because as we change and the topography of people that are here change, we find just in Grand Rapids that the populations in Grand Rapids have changed drastically just in the last 10 years. And the kind of work that we do, particularly for those persons who are in human services, becomes very different. But even if you're a salesperson in a store making very fine commissions, you still have to deal with people with languages, with cultures that are different than yours. And so the first thing I taught myself was to learn to say that I'm different from them, not that they are different from me. Because when we say that other people are different, we sort of put them in a pejorative place. So I always determine that I'm the one that will be different so that I can give the other person a positive piece. Because usually when we say, well, you know, they're different, we really don't mean it in the most positive way. And that began to make me look at what things people say, which are what microaggressions basically are. What things people say to one another that can be very hurtful. Microaggressions and micro insults are hurtful. And oftentimes we don't know that we've hurt someone, but they nonetheless are hurtful. And sometimes we don't know that we've hurt someone because we're not aware of what their culture has taught them. Yesterday, literally, I decided, after 2 years of being called sunshine every day by a woman that I happen to know quite well, I decided that I would share with her that being called sunshine was not a happy thing for me. And it was a very difficult task. If one is African American and you're over 60, you know that sunshine was a kind of a negative thing, and it comes out of the idea that our teeth and our eyes shone in our black skins. And early on in this country, many African Americans who used to be colored and then got to be Negroes and then got to be Afro-American, then got to be black, then got to be African American, got called sunshine. I was called sunshine oftentimes when I was a kid. Didn't necessarily like it because I learned from my parents that sunshine was a pejorative for African American people. So it's long been implanted, embedded in me. So I finally shared that with her and gave her the history, and she said she had never known that. And I said, anybody in your family do it? She said, well, my dad always called all colored people sunshine. That was the answer right there. It was a microaggression, but it was totally unintentional. But for me, every time she said it, it slightly hurt or pinged or zinged, like being called a pickaninny when I was a child. It pinged, it zinged, because I knew pickaninny wasn't a positive word. So I have to share a little bit about my background, which is one of the things that made me look into this. I am in my 70s, and I was born a long time ago before the sun rose in the east in Manistee, Michigan. Manistee, Michigan is a sundown town, or was a sundown town. And if you don't know what a sundown town is, there are over 1,000 sundown towns in Michigan up through the 1970s. And they were the towns that said, Native Americans, blacks, coloreds, be out of town before the sun sets. There were over 1,000 up until the 70s. So, my parents moved there in 1929. God knows why. We like to say that my dad was lost. He was a chauffeur and he couldn't find his way back home. We don't have any other reason other than he moved there, driving a family to Manistee, decided that he liked it, went back and got his young bride, who was only 19 years old, and brought her back. And she was terrified, absolutely terrified, out of Georgia, the heart of Georgia, and did not know what she was coming to. And my mother said she was terrified because there was snow, which she had never seen before, and there was a great deal of snow. And she couldn't figure out how she would ever be able to walk in it, how she would ever be able to live in it. And for 3 years, she cried every night and begged my father to take her back. And since he didn't, she left him. She left him for 9 months and came back with a new baby, okay? And that says to you that she was pregnant when she left. And by the way, she came back and stayed, and they had 7 more children. So I'm one of 10 children born in an all-white town in the 30s in Manistee, Michigan, where every day we were subjected to microaggressions of one kind or another. But of course, in those days, microaggressions was not what we said. We just were hurt, and we'd go home and say to Mom, so-and-so said so-and-so to me today, and her favorite refrain was, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Unfortunately, I did not believe her, therefore I was in the principal's office a considerable amount of time. I was known as the person who beat the crap out of anybody who said anything that I didn't like, and since I'm in the middle of the 5 girls, the 2 older sisters and the 2 younger sisters were much nicer than I, and didn't fight. And so when they would come home and say that, I would plan how I would attack that person the next day. And I left a number of bodies throughout grade school in various places, sometimes in the churchyard after choir practice, sometimes after school, sometimes on the way home from school. I had a rather bad reputation, and by the time I had put 2 boys in the hospital, my parents actually thought they ought to talk to me seriously about my behavior, because now I was just plain being aggressive all the time. But I thought that I was justified by the kinds of things that people said. So when John Anderson referred to me as a Hershey bar one day, standing in line in the 5th grade, you know, you used to have to stand in line in order for class to end, and then you all filed out. And I thought, well, I don't think that's a very good thing for him to say. The next day, they did find him on the playground after recess, projectile vomiting. And I am sorry, but you know, he did not forget. He did not forget, and we did talk about it in the 10th grade. But that Hershey bar hurt me, because he wasn't going to call anybody else in the class a Hershey bar, because there was nobody else in the class who was colored or black. So as I began to learn about microaggressions, I began to reflect on all of the things that my sisters and brothers and my parents went through. And the fact that I think I have a rather interesting family, because we are able, when we get together, to talk about some of the days that were really, really painful. But we never talked about them to one another as children, and we didn't share them with our parents that much, because I think we innately realized that it would cause them pain to know that there was nothing that they could really do, because you have to understand, they were powerless people. They were quite powerless. They were able to raise their family. They chose to stay there. My father never learned to read or write. My mother went to the 3rd grade. They had these wonderful plans that their children would go to college, even though I dare say Mom and Dad had no idea what college really was, but they heard the folks around them say it that they worked for, and so they planned that we would go to college. And my mother says that when they bought their house, the same house that we're living in now, in 1935, that she and my father cleared the backyard, and they embraced one another and said they would prove to white people that colored people were as good as they were. And that's why I think they had the rest of us, because they needed, you know, a sample to work with. And so you have 10 children to do that. But those 10 children did go through some angst and some really difficult days. Some days when you were hurt badly enough to go to your room and simply shut the door and cry. And it was not easy, because, of course, there were always more than one person sleeping in a bedroom. But you got your privacy when you could find it. So I understood that microaggressions are a part of everybody's lives, and I think it's important to recognize how that happens. I'm going to try to hope that I do everything. That's a little harsh. It's a little difficult. But it is the one thing that we don't like to talk about. Dr. Daryl Wing Sue has become probably the primary person in working with microaggressions, and has actually begun to talk, teach, and write about microaggressions. He has written a couple of books that I use in teaching my classes, and he was here 2 weeks ago at Grand Valley speaking. Microaggressions are really very brief, and the simplest way to talk about them is they are everyday exchanges that send denigrating, devaluing messages to people of color, and specifically because they belong to a racial minority group. And we do it absolutely unintentionally. We do it within group and back and forth, cross groups, and we do it without thinking about it, because it has been planted so very early. It's almost like using the lenses in our lives to look through that we gain as children. For many of you, if you think about some of the movies that we have and some of the television shows that we have, you get an apt picture of how early we get these things planted. For instance, if you look at the Jungle Book that took place a long time ago, well, really not so long ago if you think about it, but if you're old enough, 1967 is when the Jungle Book first came out, but they show it every now and then. And it has gorillas and orangutans that sound like black people. They have accents. They sound like black people. And then there's Oliver and Company, which is another old one with a Chihuahua with a Latino accent who actually talks about stealing cars. So if you got a 5 and a 6-year-old watching that, or even a 7 and an 8 or a 9-year-old watching, we're embedding, we're planting already. We're planting ways to think and to see other people. If you look at The Lady and the Tramp, that's a good one. It features Siamese cats that have decidedly Siamese features and buck teeth and slanted eyes, and they're really depicted as relatively sinister and cunning and extremely manipulative. And that's okay too, because we've put about another stereotype out there. So our children begin to think because it's planted. You plant seeds, they usually give flowers sooner or later. If we look at some of the more recent releases in terms of movies, we could talk about The Lion King, Tarzan, Pocahontas. In Aladdin, for instance, he talks about bad Arabs. They have thick foreign accents, all the bad people in Aladdin. And Aladdin himself is a fresh-faced boy with American features. He just has brown skin in the movie, okay? But Jafar looks very Arabic and very, very frightening, and he sings the songs about cutting off ears if you're bad and that sort of thing. So we plant seeds. If you look at The Lion King, the hyenas, with Miss Whoopi Goldberg being one of them, they were definitely gang people, street, inner city, sinister laughs. They had these other interesting looks. They spoke in African-American dialect. Tarzan, 1999. It's in Africa, doesn't feature any black people, which is really kind of interesting. Think about it. Does feature a lot of animals, but not black people, okay? The only people you see there are white people in Africa. If you look at Peter Pan, and everybody likes Peter Pan, Princess Tiger Lily's father represents the negative stereotyping of being uncivilized and savage as he holds the brothers hostage. In Pocahontas, she represents a positive stereotype, but you need to know the reality of Pocahontas was she was a child when John Smith came. There was no relationship between the two of them, and we portray it as something altogether different. So we really do give our children a good foundation in beginning to see other people differently or different from them. And when you begin to see someone different from you, and you've already had seeds planted, and you may live in a household where grandparents or aunts and uncles may refer to people of color in sometimes negative terms, it's very possible that little pitchers have big ears, and they hear things, and they remember them. And so, by the time they reach a class at my level, I'm talking about graduate level, I hear microaggressions all day long. Like, you know, I figured out the reason, says one student in my class, that there are so many black guys hanging out on the corners all the time is because they don't want to work. And so someone else in class said, well, how do you know they don't want to work? Well, if they wanted to work, they'd be at work. All they do is stand on the corners. And then one of the other young women in the class said, yeah, and I don't even drive on those streets because my mother told me when I was a kid, make sure you have the door locked and that you lay down in the back seat if you're a kid. So I'd still tell my kids to lay down in the back seat when we drive down Franklin or Eastern, okay? That's a microaggression. And they don't mean it harmfully. They don't mean it to hurt. But for an African American or a Latino student sitting in the class, it zings, it pings. It is a microaggression. We do it every single day. Let me tell you about mine. And I'm never going to forget it because it was the most outrageous one I've ever done. I'm driving down Burton, just getting ready to cross Eastern. And I see two black males riding bicycles coming toward me. It's April, so they don't have jackets on. I remember one shirt was flapping in the breeze, and the other one wasn't. As they came toward me, I remember consciously thinking, probably DUIs, don't have no driver's license. And I drove on down Burton, just as nice as you please, turned right onto Madison. I was going to drop a package off in Heritage Hill, and I saw a young European-American male coming toward me, and he too was riding a bike. And I remember that he had a polo shirt on and khaki Bermudas. And I said, geez, must be nice to be able to have time to ride your bike in the morning before you go to work. Okay. Within and without, we all do it. I am an overweight woman. You should see my ticker tape that runs across my mind when I see other people that are more overweight than me. That's the best way to say it. I'm making all kinds of comments like, who told her she could wear that? My God, that really is a muffin top. Well, that girl should not have that shirt on. Oh my goodness, these people are down here at the beach in bathing suits. At least I have my shorts and a tank top on. You know, I do it all of the time. We all do it. I didn't say those things out loud, but I think them. The possibility is when you think things, you can also say them. And we do that all of the time. They're oftentimes delivered sort of in the form of subtle kinds of compliments. You know, Joni, you are so pretty. If you would just lose some weight, you'd be such a pretty woman. Or, my God, big as you are, you really can shake a rug. You can dance a lot, can't you? You're so light on your feet, I never would have thought it. People say that to each other. But we don't think about how the individual that heard it feels. So when we're talking about microaggressions, we're talking about subtle tones in your voice. We're talking about snubs. We're talking about dismissive gestures. We're also talking about dead-on confrontational things that we don't see as confrontational. I'm not trying to be academic about this. I'm trying to put this out here as something that we do that are so painful for so many people that they are wounded every day. And those wounds build up. And sometimes you find resentments and hostilities, never understanding why someone is standoffish with you or doesn't want to have a conversation with you, or why a student doesn't want to talk with you, because you don't know that each time you talk about the criminal justice system, you turn and look at the young black male sitting over in the corner as if he's going to reaffirm everything you've said about black people, or that he is the object of what you're talking about in the criminal justice course. But it happens all of the time. I know it happens because some of the students from criminal justice come up to my office to say, what can I do about this? And I say, you have to talk to your professor. You have to let your professor know that that does not feel good. Racial microaggressions are brief, they're commonplace, they're daily, they're verbal, they're behavioral, and they're environmental indignities. And whether they're intentional or unintentional, they communicate hostile, derogatory, and negative messages to the target persons. And whether you're aware of it or not, it's what happens. Because persons who are targets are generally powerless in some way or another to say anything. It would be like someone saying to me, you're a fat black woman, okay, which I am. I wouldn't have anything to say because I'm a fat black woman. I would just say, you're right, I need to lose weight. But the combination of fat black woman would zing. It would absolutely zing. So when we look at microaggressions, such as you saw there, how many did you hear while you watched that little piece from Crash? Anybody want to give me a guess about how many? And identify some of them? Don't everybody speak at once, it's knocking me over. Pardon?
Talked about the guy, bald head, pants sagging down, the tattoo she mentioned, all those things.
Anybody else?
Your homies.
Homies?
About the mahogany scared when she saw the two black males walking down the street, grabbing her purse and saying she wasn't a racist, that was another one.
Right?
She said she knew something bad was going to happen because of that.
Right? Right? Okay. And if you begin to think about this in terms of family and friends, do we have family or friends sometimes who speak this way and we never challenge them? Anybody? Yeah. Yeah. Right. And Daryl Wing Sue, Dr. Sue says, we really create problems for a society as we allow more and more of these microaggressions and micro-insults to take place. Even though younger people today are far more free in terms of crossing boundaries, the issues are still there and the pain factors are still there. And so then we can talk about micro assaults, because that's an explicit racial derogation. And it's characterized primarily by a verbal or nonverbal attack meant to hurt. It's meant to hurt the intended victim through name-calling, avoidant behavior, or purposeful discriminatory actions. Referring to somebody as colored, by the way, is hurtful. Referring to someone as Oriental, by the way, is hurtful. Referring to people using racial discouraging interactions, like deliberately serving a white patron before you serve a patron of color, which still takes place in Grand Rapids so frequently that some of you cannot and would not believe it. You absolutely would not believe how frequently, as a person of color, you can go into a restaurant and not be waited on. You wouldn't believe how many times, as a person of color in Grand Rapids, you can go into a store and be followed. You wouldn't believe how many times, as a person of color in a store, if you pick up something in one department because you want to match it with a color in another department, you can be stopped. I know, been there, done that, okay? Because those are micro assaults. And you know that they have to do with you because you're a person of color. But you can't say it because you're powerless, and besides, we're post-racial now. We have a black president, right? So you can't say those kinds of things, and you couldn't say them 5 years ago, and I couldn't say them 10 years ago either. But they happen every single day. It's a micro assault on the person of color. We also can cross this line and not just talk about color, because we do deal with ageism, we deal with sizeism, and we deal with ableism. So with sizeism, which is the last bastion for people determining that they can say anything to anybody who is overweight. My God, Jennifer, are you eating that sundae? You're the last person that needs it. Which is an implied, you're overweight, don't eat that ice cream. That's a micro assault on Jenny, okay? Or to say to someone who is older, well, you know, you're a little bit older and maybe we should do this way. That's an insult to a person's age. And when we look at these things, you think to yourself, I'm really just trying to be straightforward. Dr. Sue himself, in one of his books, writes about being on a plane with a gentleman who was Asian. They were traveling to Europe from the United States, traveling from Europe to the United States, and they had gotten themselves on one of the smaller planes traveling between France and London, I believe it was. And it was one that didn't have that many people on it, and they were the only two people on the plane in the beginning. I think he said it was London to France, or else it was Milwaukee to Chicago, one or the other. Can't remember now. And at any rate, he was on one of those 14-seaters, and they thought they were going to be fine. There would be the only two people on the plane. Two other gentlemen get on the plane as well. Dr. Sue and his friend are sitting in the front, and two other gentlemen get on and sit right behind them. And just before they get ready to take off, the flight attendant comes and says to Dr. Sue and his friend, since there are only 4 people on the plane, I would like to ask the two of you to move to the back because I need to balance the flight. And he says in his book, I was offended, my friend was offended, and we asked, why did we have to move to the back? Why didn't she ask the other gentleman to move? And she was very offended, saying she was just trying to balance the plane. He said that he and his friend actually did move to the back, where they continued their conversation and doing the work that they were doing. But both of them commented on the fact, here they are, 2 professors, 2 men of high prestige, both of them men of color, saying they felt the zing. They felt that they were asked to move to the back of the plane because they were people of color, and they wanted to know, why had not the 2 white men been asked? And I am not trying today in this piece of microaggressions to make anybody feel uptight, anxious, or feel like they are being racist. What I am doing is what I do every day in my classes and every day in my life as well, is remind myself that I need to plant triggers in myself, and to remind others that we need to have triggers in ourselves so that we can move forward in this area where one day, perhaps, it really will come true that Dr. King's dream won't be just a dream, it'll be a reality. Right now, I don't feel like that's happening. Because the effect to negate people and where they were born and to convey to people that they're foreign continues even to this day. For instance, it's very frequent that you hear people say when you're having conversations of this nature, well, I don't see color. I just see you as a person. So how do you think I would respond to something like that? Anybody? Come on, don't be shy.
Obviously, they do see color, because other than that, they wouldn't have made the comment.
Okay, obviously they do see color. Other than that, they wouldn't have made the comment. Right. Exactly, and I always say to them, please, I hope you see my color, because if you don't, then I'm not here. And plus, that's the only thing this country left me, was my color. That's the one thing that they gave us, our ability to be people of color. So people of color have a right to keep it. And when you devalue us and deny us access to who we are based on our color, which is the way this country has defined it, then we're just not there. So to be colorblind is not necessarily the lens that you want to have, because you're taking away a portion of a person. And that's one of the things that happens also, that becomes then a kind of a micro-invalidation. You just simply invalidate the person. They're no longer there because, after all, you don't see color. When a Latino person is given poor service at a restaurant and shares their experience sometimes with white friends, oftentimes they will hear, you're too sensitive. You shouldn't worry about that way. Don't be so petty. Well, then their experience is being nullified. It's being demeaned. It's as if it didn't happen. Don't talk about that. That's not the way it really is. It's not the way it really is for the dominant group, but it is that way for people of color. There are 9 categories of microaggressions that have distinct themes. You can be an alien in one's own land. There's ascription of intelligence. You know, some people are, we just don't think some people are as intelligent. There's color blindness. There's criminality assumption of criminal status. There's denial of individual racism. There's the myth of meritocracy, that everything is flat. And there's pathologizing cultural values and communication styles. There's second-class status, and there's environmental invalidation. And we can move through them very, very easily because they make perfect sense. And there are things that we do on kind of a regular basis. So if you're an alien in one's own land, you might ask somebody, where are you from? And that says you are not American. However, you might be Mexican whose parents have been in California since their parents' parents were in the 1500s. And so you never did move, and you've always been in America. But because you're Mexican, when did your parents come here? Because that's what we think. So you are not an American. There's an ascription of intelligence. When people say, you're a credit to your race, or as I've heard people say to me so often, you're so very articulate. You speak so well. Well, I grew up in Manistee. Everybody was white. What do you think I'm going to sound like? You know, I sound like the group that I grew up with. But it means people of color are generally not as intelligent as whites. Subtle, small things. They are always small things, but keep in mind that they're planted so early on for all of us, because you can be sure that people of color have their issues too. Like, I will tell you point blank, I don't like to be left in affluent neighborhoods late at night, because I'm afraid someone will ask me why I'm there. Affluent neighborhoods generally mean to me that they're all white. I don't like to be in rural areas that I know are all white and be lost, because I'm somewhat concerned about what people will say. We all have our own issues in terms of this thing about race. I have not been without being planted the seeds of what you watch out for. I planted those same seeds in my sons, so that when Corey did come home when he was 17 and say, Mom, what's this about ladies always grabbing their purses when I'm around, and especially if it's Bo and me together. I have 2 sons, they're in their 50s now, but this was then. And they were both quite tall. one was sort of a caramel brown and the other one was dark brown. And they would say to me, people will grab their purses and they hung out together all the time. So Corey comes home telling me about this lady got off the elevator when they got on. And I said, honey, it's because you're black and you're a male. And, they're growing up in Ann Arbor. He says, what's that got to do with it? And I said, Corey, by now you're bright enough to figure that one out. I don't really have to explain that to you. So Bo says to him, let me tell you about it, brother. I'm blacker than you. I know more of it than you do. He says, it happens to me more than it does to you. And so we had our little conversation about it. Because it does happen. It's a micro assault on their person as black people, and they are criminalized because they're black males. And most black males in this country are criminalized. When you think criminal, if you were really to be truthful and honest, if we think criminal, thug, drug addict, what's the first picture that flashes across your face? The back of your mind. The ticker tape that runs like it does on Fox and MSNBC, that you can't read it and watch the tube at the same time if you're me, but you know that it's there. Well, we all have that ticker tape that runs through the back of our heads all the time, making comments about every single thing that we see. And sometimes we verbalize them. Sometimes we behaviorize them. Frequently, we act on them. They're all microaggressions. If you are looking at a person and you say that you're colorblind, then when I look at you, I don't see color, then you're denying a person of their color, their racial, ethnic experience, and you're indicating that you don't want to acknowledge race. But race is here. We are a people of many, many colors and many, many hues. It's a wonderful thing. We certainly wouldn't want to have just one kind of flower. That's a trite statement, I know. But can you imagine if it was all daffodils? I like daffodils, but if there was no break in the daffodils or the flowers and that's all you had to have, it'd be interesting. It'd be different. It'd be strange. So when we say that we have these pieces that we do on a regular basis, we do them. And we do teach early. And we do know that we do have several lenses that we could be looking at life through, and that each of us has our individual truths. I'm going to give this a try. We have legacies. We have layers of legacies. We know that we have the ability to be an assimilationist. You have the ability to be colorblind. We can be cultural centrist. We can be elitist. We can be an integrationist. We can be a meritocratist, or we can be multicultural. We can be transcendent and rise above it, and we can also be victims. And too frequently, people of color oftentimes buy into the victim role, and they become victims rather than saying, look, it's not a very good thing for you to say. Let me explain to you why. Or, can I share something with you, please, that what you've just said really kind of offended me. And I don't want to hurt your feelings, but I think it'd be better maybe if I shared with you why you might not want to say that again. It's my job to educate, which is what I'm doing up here. I'm educating. And when the same thing happens in reverse, when a person of color says something that's negative about white people, and you happen to be white, then you should say, that offends me. It might start a dialogue, a discussion that would be healthy that hadn't taken place between you and that other person ever. And that's one of the things that we have problems with in this United States of America. Or as my sister says, this not so United States of America, that we don't talk about race because we are frightened to death of it. We are frightened. We are living in a country right now that politically says we are very frightened of race in America. So if you're talking about your lenses that I've just shared with you, you really can say to yourself, I fit here someplace. Am I an assimilationist? Do I, feel that, I want individuals to kind of submerge their individual and cultural identities, and then we can be nationalistic, and we can all be American, and we can all be patriotic, and the primary allegiance should just be to our nation, and then everybody will be okay, because we won't have to talk about these things. In the meantime, though, we haven't examined ourselves to see where we are, and self-reflection becomes a very important piece. If you're a cultural centrist, you're looking at those who seek to improve the welfare of their cultural group. by accentuating their history and their identity. America, I think, at some points has been cultural centrist. People are always asking me in class, well, why didn't we learn this history in high school? Or why didn't we learn this in undergraduate? And I've said to people, because you don't teach history in its reality if you wish people to remain patriotic and nationalistic. If you want people to grow up to love their country, you don't teach them the things that happened that may be ugly. We don't talk about the history of what happened to the Asians as they entered into this country. We don't talk about the very painful things that took place. We don't talk a lot about the Japanese internment. We don't talk about the reality of the Native Americans' experience here. We don't even tell the truth about Thanksgiving. You know, we don't, because it is important that we teach our children to love our country. All countries do that. Is it possible to teach your children to love your country and teach them also the truth about their country, about themselves, about their history, so that they do not become microaggressive to other people by having learned the wrong things? So for those of you who have small children, anybody's kids in here see The Lion King? Can I see a show of hands? And when you sat down and watched The Lion King with them, did you talk about the fact that maybe the hyenas were imparting a message to them that shouldn't have been there? Not black or white or brown or yellow, we don't do it. And my job, I keep saying to myself, is to educate people. And maybe that means I'm on the cutting edge and we're being too aware. But I spent 73 years being black, and I have some issues about some of the treatment, some of the behavior. I've watched my family grow in terms of learning how to handle it as brothers and nieces and nephews married, as my mother would have said, outside of the race, don't you know? And so we now look like a united nation, some 203 persons at the last family reunion just on the Smith side. And there were people from Morocco, from Sweden, from India, from Hawaii, from Africa. There were babies that ranged from deep black to, is that baby black? Are you sure? Well, no, we're not really sure anymore, but he's ours. And it's 203 people. We look like a United Nations. And I can tell you that when my first brother married outside the race, don't you know, my mother sat through that entire wedding with her mouth turned upside down. And I said to her, Mom, smile. And she said, I am doing the best I can. Okay, she was not very receptive toward it. And she dealt in some microaggressions for the first 2 or 3 years in terms of that marriage. So did I have sisters who did the same. I was already on my roll in terms of diversity back then, so it was a little bit different, though I had my own personal feelings. Just like any other woman, you want your son, your daughters to marry people who look like their fathers and their mothers. And so when my son married a European American girl, I did struggle for a hot minute, but I smiled at the wedding, okay? And I do love me some Ingrid, and that should tell you a lot. Ingrid, long blonde hair and braids when I first met her, and bangs, she looked just like Ingrid, you know? And I'm like, okay, all right, then we can handle this. And so we handle it. But that was in the 70s. So I've been doing this for a very long time. Most people don't want to do the microaggression thing. It is a real clash of racial realities, and there is a major dilemma. How do you prove that a microaggression has occurred? And how do you do it in a manner in which people do not become offended, do not become upset, do not say, you are pushing the envelope, you're too far over the line? Nearly everybody born and raised in the United States inherits racial biases. They're the racial biases of the entire society. And there's very little that we have done about that. And the most accurate assessment about racist acts is whether they've occurred or not is likely to be made by those who have been disempowered by the racial act. It's not by the people who have the power to commit the racial act. And we know that the dominant group has had far greater access to that just based on the history of this country. So it is difficult to have the conversation. It is difficult to have the dialogue. It is difficult to even begin to stand in front of a room of people like this and speak about it. Because my ticker tape is running as I look around the room and look at people's faces. And I'm wondering, what are you thinking? What do you think about this particular kind of presentation, which is more or less down home and not theoretical at all, because it's not about theory. Most of us, when we demonstrate human behavior, we're not thinking theoretically as we do it. We do it because we're humans. And human behavior, we don't check very often. We might study it, but as we go about every day being humans, we're just behaving like humans. So the problem is, what is happening to people as they're listening? What is happening to people as they're thinking about what happens? Here's what Wing Tsu says: microaggressions in everyday life, race, gender, sexual orientation. It's about the damaging. It's about the pain. It's about the hurt. And it happens in gender, it happens in sexuality, and it happens in aged people, and it really happens in the LGBTQ community. And we're aware of that. And it's an everyday reality for people. It's an everyday reality for those groups because it does invalidate. And they are indignities. They really are. They're very painful sometimes. Like when my little nephew is sitting in my office in a carry-all, and he's got two big puffs on the side of his head of hair because his mother hasn't cut his hair yet. And someone comes in and says, "Oh, I just want to touch his hair." Now, I know a lot of African Americans who will say, "You may not touch my child's hair," for this very reason. One of the reasons. She reached down and touched his hair, and she said, "Oh my God, it's soft." I said, "Well, yeah, he's a baby." She said, "I thought it would be like Brillo." It was hurtful. Fortunately, the baby didn't get too hurt because he was only 9 months old, but it was hurtful. And so I said to her, "You know, that was a very painful thing you just said. Why would a baby's hair feel like Brillo?" I said, "Just think about babies. Why would a baby's hair feel like Brillo?" And she said she was really very sorry. She had just never thought about it. That's what she always thought, that all colored people's hair felt that way. And I said, "Okay, would you like to touch mine?" You know, I was wearing dreadlocks, so, you know, whatever. They probably felt like Brillo. But that was the pain, the factor that went through for me for my, we do it. We just simply do it. It happens. Family members will say things to one another, but that's within. And even within groups, people will call each other the N-word, and they'll say homie. They may even use the word dago or spick within group. And so outside groups then want to know why they can't. Well, why should you? Everybody has within things they say. Families have within things they say. And they're not allowed to pass outside the family. So the whole idea of if you call each other the N-word, why can't I call you the N-word? It's because you know it's a pejorative when you use it. You know that historically that's all it's ever meant was a pejorative. It's a put down, it's a negative. So if I wish to, within my group, turn it into an endearment, that's an entirely different situation. So you explain it to people. And hopefully they can accept it and understand it using a little critical thinking. But it does happen. It doesn't matter if it's a teacher, if it's a clerk, if it's whatever, it happens. My 7-year-old was the size of an 11-year-old when he was in the 2nd grade. Let me tell you, it was very painful because he was wearing men's shoes by the time he was in the 4th grade, and I did not have that kind of money. But his teacher said she was really kind of uptight because she'd never had a big black kid in the class before, and he was 7 years old. And she treated him very, very differently. So I took him out and homeschooled him for an entire year until he could go into another classroom. You have to do things. You have to teach your kids right off the bat. If you're a person of color, there are some things that are going to happen to you. We don't say you're going to be exposed to microaggressions, but you do tell them that they are going to experience some everyday racism, some everyday behaviors that are difficult, but they need to learn how to handle them. Some of the research that Wing Tsu and others have done has shown that these everyday experiences that these people go through, me, other people of color, people who are aging, women, LGBTQs, really, really suffer in negative emotional states. They deal with self-doubt. They deal with frustration. They deal with isolation. They deal with lack of power. They feel put down. There's a considerable amount of emotional turmoil that takes place when an incident happens as you figure out how to get over it and how to move on. And that these can be destructive over the long haul to people who are every day treated in that manner. If we just look at the LGBTQ community, when did you decide that you were gay? Well, don't you think if you just had a fling with a dude that you could change? I mean, you're not really a lesbian, are you? I mean, aren't you just trying this out? Well, what made you decide? You know, we ask these kinds of questions just as frankly, freely, and openly whenever we get ready to, not realizing that we have been offensive to an individual who was born gay, to an individual who was born transgendered or born in the wrong body. We are offensive when we say these things as if they have no right to be born the persons that they are. It's a very, very important thing that we understand that these effects are cumulative and that it becomes really difficult for these people to continue without levels of anger, resentment, and their own personal well-being suffers on a daily basis. How we react to microaggressions can have different effects as well, not only on the perpetrator but on the person of color. And deciding to do nothing and sitting on your anger is a difficult piece, and we're unable oftentimes to determine whether the microaggression was intentional or whether it actually has occurred, or whether we are so overly sensitive at a certain point in our lives that we don't really know what to say, and so we're at a loss to respond. And so many people, as I said earlier, simply will not educate you. And thirdly, we know that if we respond with anger, we're out of luck. That's very difficult, because the minute you respond with anger, then you're manifesting and demonstrating what everybody says. Well, black people get angry so quickly and they're so loud. And just as students will say in a classroom, well, I don't want to talk about race in class because the colored kids always get mad and they get really loud and then I get scared. And they actually will say it, and you have to respect it. You have to respect, because that's how they feel. I have to respect it at the same time saying to them, well, first of all, they're African American, and secondly, the loudness might be cultural, and thirdly, maybe they're not so much angry as they are hurt. So let's back up and try it again. It's a whole educational piece that you go through. So here we are. The power of microaggressions lies in the invisibility to the perpetrator, who is often unaware that he or she has really even engaged in something that demeans or devalues the person who's receiving that. Here's a couple of things. You might just want to read this one. This one really bothers me a lot, okay? And I won't even bother to read it out loud to you, because when you get to the right point, you'll say, oh, my goodness. But those kinds of things happen. Yes, I know somebody who's into dogs. What does that have to do with being a lesbian? Okay? Here's a gay adolescent. And we hear people say, that's so gay all of the time. And what happens to the person who is gay? Or, dude, you're a fag. Well, what happens to the person who is gay? But it's okay. It's a microaggression. We're not necessarily buying into it. Ableism is another one. People who are blind or wheelchair bound, who are shouted at. They are not talked to. If you're sitting in a wheelchair, they talk to the person who's with you, but not you, as if you have no ability to speak. It's called ableism, and we do it. It's also called a microaggression, behavioral microaggression. A person with a disability is always defined as a lesser, which is why we don't say he's in a wheelchair. We say Mike uses a wheelchair, because Mike is much more than the wheelchair. But we always define people, well, he's in a wheelchair, you know. No, he uses a wheelchair. It's learning how to speak to persons and give them all the value and all the dignity that they deserve. Here's another one, a parent-teacher conference where a boy is sleeping in the classroom. The teacher doesn't ask him. And this has happened to some of us who teach. And we have students who are sleeping in class. Unless you ask them, we're just going to say they were out too late or they were doing something. But there are students who do that. I had one when I was at the University of Virginia, and when he told me he was a chicken debeaker at night, I still didn't believe him because I had never heard of a chicken debeaker, obviously. It was in the 80s, and I said, well, I've never heard of any such thing. I don't believe you. And he said to me, I can tell you where I work, and you can call up or you can go by there. I actually went by, and I found out that they do debeak chickens so that they can fatten them up faster. I was appalled, to say the least. I stopped eating chicken for a while. But yes, he was, and he worked all night because he was a support to his family. He was also an honor student at the University of Virginia. And he said, I just fell asleep. I just couldn't help it. I just couldn't help it. Okay? So here's the one about trashy and classless, and the hidden message is lower class, classless, okay? Here we do this all the time. We always wish everybody Merry Christmas. Everybody doesn't celebrate Christmas. Some people celebrate holidays. I don't celebrate Christmas. I am not Muslim. I just happen to like Kwanzaa better than Christmas. So I celebrate Kwanzaa. And you're welcome to come on the 16th to the Loosmore at 6:30 in the evening if you like, because we're celebrating Kwanzaa, and there's a free meal afterward, because you always have a festive feast. So, Kwanzaa, 6:30, Loosmore Auditorium, it's free. There we go, I got past that one. Don't try to do me down. We've heard that, and we do that, and we say that. Those are all microaggressions, and as long as they remain hidden, invisible, unapproachable, and as long as we don't address them and we excuse one another, then, as Dr. Wing Sue says, we'll continue to oppress, we'll marginalize, we'll devalue people, we will maintain these kinds of things. Some of my best friends are white. But we usually say some of my best friends are black or Asian or whatever. Or some of my friends are LGBTQ. So here's a list of some of the things we say. It was only a joke. I didn't mean anything by that. I've always liked the last one. I don't care if you're pink, purple, or orange. I treat everybody exactly the same. Well, if I saw somebody who was pink, purple, or orange, I probably would not treat them the same. Okay? Why can't we just move on? Those are things we hear. We keep talking about it, but I need strategies. I just need to know what to do. What is your reality for your world of microaggressions? Do you think you've used them? Have there been consequences for you? We can learn from each other's experiences, and I would like to just share this one last YouTube now that I think I got this thing together here, which is kind of funny. Am I doing this right? Yep. Yeah. Right. Here we go, up here. Yep. And then I hit this one. Yep. And I hope for the best.
So do I. You want to make it big?
Yep.
My name is Mr. Simpson. I am the head principal here at Razoo Junior High School. Young man, what is your name? My name is Alejandro Gonzalez. Ali what? My name is Alejandro Gonzalez. That is not an American name, is it? Well, I am going to call you Al for short. Where did you learn English? I was born in San Antonio. Was that right after your parents came over from Mexico? My parents were born in Dallas. We have lots of Mexican students here. We have a good, disciplined school. I do not put up with any trouble around here. Do you understand me, Al? I was an honor student at my past school. Does your father work on the Jones Ranch? Or is he a roofer? My father has just been hired by the police station. Janitorial work is an honest trade. There is no need to be ashamed. He is the new police chief. Who would have ever thought it? You will be happy here as long as you stay in line. You can tell all your brothers and sisters the same thing. We treat all students the same here at Brazil Junior High School.
Okay? So, wow. That's the end of my little presentation, which was not at all scholarly or academic. It's just to the point. And I've begun to think that most of us, when we practice stereotypes, microaggressions, or behavior that is sometimes painful, we don't, as I said, use theory. We just act like human beings. So I'm ready to, if anybody wants to ask me any questions or tell me what they think, I'm open for that for the next few minutes. Yes? Oh, hooray! It's at the Loosemore at the downtown campus of Grand Valley. On Winter, the parking lot's on Winter. If you come after 6:30, you can get into the parking lot and it's free, and then you just see the signs that point you to the Loosemore Auditorium. There'll be signs out. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. She said she had never known that, but she also told me that her parents called everybody who was black Sunshine. So did her grandparents. So she always thought it was okay. No, because I am not always upbeat and smiling. I am known as the woman curmudgeon, okay? Yes, sir? If you think and if you feel that that's something that's happened to you, you could say to the person in a very gentle way, I really don't have anything in here other than what I've bought, and I plan to pay for all of it, and I don't need your assistance right now. You can be nice about it. Don't do what I used to do, which was if I thought I was being followed in a store, especially when I lived in upstate New York, I would just fill the basket up with everything under the sun and then get to the cashier and say, I've decided I don't want it. After she checked everything through, I'd say, oh, you know what? I don't want this. I need to see the manager. I stopped doing that because it got a little iffy. Okay. You had your hand up, sir? Or just reaching each other in general on an everyday level. Okay. Thank you. Yes.